I did not understand, at first, that my son had chosen the hospital because it was the cleanest place to take a man's life away from him. Not his life in the literal sense. Adrian was too careful for that, and his wife, Celeste, liked her sins dressed as concern. What they wanted was something quieter, signature by signature, visitor by visitor. A room with white walls, lowered voices, and forms clipped to the foot of a bed. By the time I understood it, I was already wearing the bracelet. My name is James Bernett. I am 78 years old. For 46 of those years, I built Bernett Linen and Supply into the kind of business people make jokes about until they need it. We supplied tablecloths, uniforms, napery, hospital sheets, kitchen rags, pressed jackets, monogrammed service linen, and the small invisible order that keeps other people's elegant lives from collapsing in public. Restaurants with white candles, hotels with marble lobbies, private clinics with polished floors and smiling receptionists. They all liked to imagine dignity came naturally. It never does. Someone has to wash it, fold it, and deliver it before sunrise. That someone was me for most of my life. Later, it became my drivers, my plant supervisors, my route managers, my women in finishing, my men at the loading docks, the people who never made magazine covers and never wanted to. I knew the names of their children. I attended funerals, weddings, christenings, and 3 ugly divorces. When a boiler broke in February, I stood there in my coat until midnight. When a hotel group threatened to leave us in 2009, I drove to Hartford myself and sat in a lobby for 4 hours until their director agreed to see me. I believed in work the way some men believe in scripture. Quietly, without decoration. My wife, Teresa, used to say that was both my strength and my defect. "She will love you for it," she once said, speaking of no one in particular while she peeled pears in our kitchen, "and she will punish you for it too. Work is a woman that always wants 1 more hour." She had a way of telling the truth without making a sound larger than necessary. I have missed that voice for 6 years now. Adrian was 38 when he began speaking to me as though I were already a framed photograph. Celeste, 10 years younger and polished in that expensive, understated way that only very expensive women can manage, started doing the same shortly after the wedding. They came to the house more often after Teresa died, but not out of grief, out of timing. There is a difference. Grief sits beside you without checking its watch. Timing smiles too quickly and asks about estate planning before the coffee is poured. I noticed it because old age, for all its humiliations, does sharpen certain instincts. You no longer waste them on charm. At first, it was gentle. "You should simplify things, Dad. You've carried enough. You don't need to be in the office every day. This company deserves a modern structure." Celeste was better at saying what Adrian wanted. She worked in brand consulting before marrying into my family, and after the marriage she discovered a talent for speaking in sentences that contained no fingerprints. She used words like transition, legacy, stewardship, refresh. She could take a theft and make it sound like a seasonal menu. Adrian was less elegant. He had my shoulders and none of my patience. He had been born into stability and mistook that for talent. When he entered the company at 26, I gave him a route division to manage. He lasted 9 months before deciding logistics was beneath him. After that, he floated from marketing to vendor relations to strategic development, titles that grew larger as his competence thinned. He was not stupid. That would have been simpler. He was worse than stupid. He was entitled. He believed proximity to labor was the same thing as labor itself. Teresa saw it long before I admitted it. "You keep forgiving the same weakness because he came from me," she told me one winter night, folding one of my shirts with the precise irritation of a woman who has earned the right to be honest. "That is not mercy, James. That is fear." Fear of what? That if you see him clearly, you'll have to choose. I told her she was being cruel. She kissed my cheek and said, "No, I am warning you while I still can." I remembered those words in the hospital, not immediately. Pain makes men stupid, and humiliation makes them slower. The incident itself was almost laughably small. That is how these things usually begin. Not with a dramatic collapse, not with an ambulance in the rain. Just exhaustion. I had been working too much. That part was true. We were renegotiating 3 major contracts at once, and our main pressing line had failed inspection after a mechanical issue that should have been caught earlier. I was at the plant by 6, home after 9, sleeping badly, eating worse. Adrian and Celeste insisted on taking me to lunch one Sunday. They arrived with a bottle of wine for a meal neither of them intended to cook. We went to a restaurant by the marina. Celeste wore cream silk and concern. Adrian wore a watch I knew he could not afford without assuming, somewhere in his heart, that I would die on schedule. Halfway through the meal, I felt tightness in my chest and a pressure behind my eyes. Nothing cinematic, no clutching of the table, just a dull, spreading wrongness. Celeste stood before I had finished saying I needed air. Adrian had his phone out before I had finished standing. An ambulance arrived with a speed that impressed me then and insulted me later. At the hospital, they answered questions directed at me. They mentioned fatigue, confusion, recent forgetfulness. Celeste told a nurse I had repeated myself 3 times at brunch the week before. Adrian said I had nearly signed the wrong payroll authorization on Thursday. Neither thing was true. Or rather, like most useful lies, each contained the shape of something possible. I was tired. I had been forgetting names more often than I used to. I had once initialed the wrong stack of papers until Ruth Salazar, my operations director, caught it and handed me the correct file. That was enough. Truth does not need to be replaced. It only needs to be tilted. I was admitted for observation. Observation became evaluation. Evaluation became a temporary recovery stay in the private wing of a rehabilitation hospital 40 minutes from home. The first night there, Adrian kissed my forehead. The gesture nearly made me slap him. "Just rest, Dad," he said. "We're handling everything." Handling. There it was. My phone disappeared by morning. Celeste said she had taken it home to charge because I needed uninterrupted sleep. My reading glasses were nowhere to be found. My briefcase did not arrive from the house. When I asked for the business section of the newspaper, the nurse on day shift smiled and said perhaps later. A physician I had met once wrote in my chart that family reported episodic disorientation under stress. Under stress. A beautiful phrase, soft enough to excuse almost any theft. I might have lost faster if not for the night aid. Her name was Elena Maris, and she was 29 years old with tired eyes, plain scrub tops, and a habit of listening all the way to the end of a sentence. I learned later that she worked the night shift because the pay differential helped cover her mother's medication and her younger brother's engineering tuition. At the time, all I knew was that she adjusted my blanket without speaking to me like a child. On her 3rd night in my room, she asked, "Mister." Bernetta, do you prefer James? It was such a simple question that I nearly laughed. No one in this building has thought to ask me that. She made a small note on the chart. Then I will. That was the first crack in the wall. The second came an hour later when she asked me to confirm the date and location for a cognition check. I answered correctly. Then she said, "And the current prime rate." I looked at her. A shadow of a smile crossed her face. "I saw you reading the financial pages yesterday before they took them away." "Interesting word," I said. "Took." She did not answer, which is how I knew I had not imagined anything. By dawn, she had found my glasses in a drawer at the nurse station, wrapped in a paper towel as though I had wandered in blind and left them there out of whim. She returned them without ceremony. The next night she brought me the newspaper folded to the business section. The night after that, she asked whether Bernetta Linen had really started with one delivery van and a boiler room in East Haven. "You've heard of us?" "My grandfather worked in hotel laundry in New Haven," she said. "He used to say the best-run people in Connecticut were the ones no one ever saw." It was not flattery. That is another reason I trusted her. I began telling her the company's history because I was angry, and because anger, when it has nowhere to go, will settle into speech. I told her about my first plant lease, about Teresa doing invoices at the kitchen table, about winter contracts and fuel spikes and labor fights and the year we nearly lost everything after a flood ruined half our storage inventory. I told her about the time Adrian was 7 and fell asleep on bundled aprons in the finishing room, while his mother and I argued over whether he should be there so late. Elena listened while checking my blood pressure. Sometimes she asked practical questions. "What's your margin on hospital contracts? Why don't hotels own their own laundry systems anymore? If your son says he's helping, what has he actually changed?" That last question stayed with me. On the 5th day, Adrian arrived with papers. He wore navy. Celeste wore pale gray. Together, they looked like the kind of couple whose lives are photographed for magazines about urban interiors and inherited confidence. "Dad," Adrian said gently, "we just need a temporary signature so I can authorize a few operational decisions while you recover. Nothing major." The tabs in the document were yellow. I noticed that before I noticed the language. Interim executive authority. Emergency contract discretion. Temporary voting rights tied to my share structure. Not major. I did not sign. Celeste sat beside the bed and laid her hand over mine with a tenderness so rehearsed I almost respected it. "This is just to protect what you built," she said. "Your staff needs clarity." "My staff," I said, "needs wages paid on Thursday and starch delivered on Tuesday. Clarity is what people with no practical value use when they want power." Adrian's jaw tightened. "You're not thinking clearly." "Then leave the papers and let me think in private." He did not leave the papers. He took them with him, which told me more than any sentence could have. That night I asked Elena to call Ruth Salazar from memory. "You trust me enough for that?" she asked. "No," I said, "but I trust you more than my son." She considered that for a moment, then nodded once. Ruth arrived the next afternoon under the pretense of bringing me a sweater. She is 62, sharp as wire, and has run the actual soul of Bernetta Linen for 18 years, while men with better hair pretended strategy happened in conference rooms. She closed the door to my room, placed the sweater on the chair, and took one look at my face. "How bad?" "Bad enough that Adrian brought signature tabs before he brought my shoes." That told her everything. Ruth opened her bag and handed me copies of internal memos, board notices, a proposed asset review, and a draft consulting agreement with a private equity firm called Torrance Capital. Adrian had begun conversations about exploring liquidity events. Celeste had prepared brand language for a legacy renewal. There was even a concept document for repositioning the company after a likely sale of our main plant property. Sale, not succession. Sale. I held the papers on my lap and felt, not surprise, but a slow hardening. Teresa had warned me that seeing clearly would force a choice. There it was. What else? I asked. Ruth hesitated. They've been telling people you're declining faster than you are. Not publicly. Quietly. Vendors. 2 department heads. 1 board member. And you? I told them I'd believe it when I heard it from you. I nearly wept then, not because I am sentimental, but because loyalty, when it arrives in old age, feels like water in a dry place. You know immediately how close you had come to thirst. I asked Ruth for one more thing. Bring my attorney. His name was Conrad Bell. He had been my counsel for 30 years and had the respectful impatience of a man who billed by the hour, but disliked seeing time wasted dishonorably. 2 nights later, he sat at the edge of my hospital bed reading through amendments to my will, trust structure, voting shares, and medical directives. What exactly do you want to do? He asked. I looked at the ceiling for a long moment. First, I want them stopped. And then, I thought of Adrian's hand on my forehead, Celeste's careful voice, the vanished phone, the little humiliations meant to reduce me from man to matter. Then, I want them to understand that they mistook blood for entitlement. Conrad removed his glasses. That's an emotion, James. I need an instruction. I turned my head and looked toward the doorway where Elena was charting something at the station outside. She had no idea that I could see her reflection in the glass. I want Bernetta linen transferred out of my son's reach before I leave this building. Conrad was silent. He had known me too long to rush in with reason. To Ruth? He asked finally. Ruth gets operational control and board protection. She has earned that. And ownership? There are moments in a life when the truth arrives before its explanation. This was one of them. Elena Maris. He stared at me for a full 3 seconds. The aide? The woman, I said quietly, who returned my name to me. Conrad, to his credit, did not laugh. He only narrowed his eyes and began asking the kind of questions good lawyers ask when they suspect their client is either brilliant or insane. Had she solicited anything? No. Had I promised her anything? No. Was I being coerced, seduced, manipulated? Certainly not. Did I understand the consequences of removing my son entirely from controlling inheritance? Perfectly. Did I want this done immediately or testamentary only? Immediately. Why her? He asked at last. I could have given him a sentimental answer. I could have said kindness. I could have said moral clarity. Both would have been true and insufficient. Instead, I said, because a business is a custodial act, Conrad. People think it belongs to the visionary. It doesn't. It belongs to the one who shows up when the room smells bad and everyone else has gone home. He said nothing after that. He only took notes. What followed over the next 3 weeks looked, from the outside, like an old man recovering. I let them believe that. Recovery is often the best disguise for planning. Adrian came and went. Celeste brought flowers in expensive arrangements that smelled like hotel lobbies. They continued pressing, softly at first, then with growing impatience. I signed nothing they placed in front of me except routine medical paperwork approved by Conrad. A consulting psychiatrist evaluated me and found no meaningful cognitive impairment. That report somehow took 4 days to circulate. Elena made sure I received a copy before anyone else. During those nights, when the wing quieted and television light flickered under half-closed doors, I spoke with her. At first about the company, then about her own life. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a bakery in Bridgeport. Her father had died young. Her mother's lungs were failing slowly, expensively. Elena had left community college to work full-time, then returned at night to finish a degree in healthcare administration because she had discovered, in the worst possible way, that hospitals are ruled less by medicine than by paperwork and power. She told me this with no self-pity. "One day," she said while changing a water pitcher, "I'd like to run a place where old people don't feel like luggage. That's not a hospital, that's a miracle." She smiled then, a tired, private smile. "Maybe it's just staffing." I started giving her articles to read, not because I was training her, not yet, because I was curious. An annual report from one of our competitors, a contract summary from one of our hotel groups, a fuel cost breakdown from our Hartford route cluster. She returned each one with notes, practical notes, human notes, not the glossy nonsense Adrian and Celeste favored. She saw what mattered, where labor churn would cost more than discounting, where linen loss in hospitals was not carelessness, but structural confusion in floor-level accountability. Why a company like mine survived not because it dazzled, but because it reduced chaos in places too proud to admit they depended on the reduction. On the 12th night, I asked, "If someone gave you a business, what would you do first?" She laughed softly. "Refuse it. After that, find the people who have been carrying it without recognition." I nodded once. That answer did not make the decision easier. It made it inevitable. By the time I was discharged, Conrad had done what I paid him to do, and what few men do well. He had translated emotion into architecture. My voting shares were moved into a new stewardship structure with immediate effect. Ruth Salazar became president and operating trustee. Elena Maris became controlling beneficiary and chair designate, subject to a transition arrangement that protected her from being devoured by men in suits the moment my pen dried. A significant employee profit pool vested over time. Long-term staff retention clauses made a predatory sale difficult without near-unanimous board approval. Adrian's role terminated automatically upon execution. He was not left destitute. I am not theatrical. He retained a personal trust from other assets substantial enough to live comfortably if he chose to be a modest man. The company, however, was no longer his to strip. When Conrad explained the full structure to Elena in a private conference room, she went pale. "No," she said immediately. "No, Mr. Bernetta, I can't." "You can," I told her. "I didn't help you for this." "I know. This will look terrible. Most correct things do to the people they inconvenience." Her eyes filled before she could stop them. "Your son will hate me." I looked at my own hands for a moment. The veins stood up like old roads. My son hates anyone who stands between him and what he has not earned. That is not the same as being hated. She turned away then, one hand pressed to her mouth. I should tell you that in stories like these, this is usually the moment when revenge tastes sweet. It did not. It tasted like iron. Necessary. Cold. not sweet, because a son is not a rival executive. He is not a disloyal vendor or a thief in payroll. He is the child whose fever you sat beside, the boy whose first school tie you knotted badly, the young man whose grief you once held together with your own hands when his mother died. Even when that boy becomes a man you would not hire, some part of you remains inhabited by his smaller versions. That is what makes betrayal expensive. It charges interest on memory. I returned home on a Thursday afternoon. Adrian and Celeste had arranged fresh flowers in the hall. My pillows had been replaced. The kitchen had new stoneware bowls I never would have bought. Everything looked curated, as though my absence had been treated as a low-budget renovation opportunity. Celeste kissed both my cheeks. "We're so happy to have you back." I smiled at her and thought, you shouldn't be. For 10 days I behaved as expected. I rested. I took meetings from home. I allowed Adrian to outline proposals he no longer had authority to execute. I asked gentle questions. I let Celeste describe a company reintroduction campaign meant to position Bernett Linen as heritage elevated. She even showed me mood boards. My wife had died, my son had tried to unmake me, and now a woman in cashmere was showing me fonts for betrayal. I nearly admired the absurdity of it. Finally, Adrian suggested we formalize the transition at the company's annual service dinner, a modest event we held each spring for senior staff, account managers, top vendors, and a few family members. He assumed, of course, that I would use the occasion to bless his ascension. The hall was already booked. Invitations were ready. He called it elegant timing. I agreed. That was the only lie I told him directly. The dinner took place on a Friday in April at the old Shoreline Club where Teresa and I had danced badly at our 25th anniversary. I arrived late on purpose. Not enough to create drama, just enough to make everyone look toward the doors. Adrian came to greet me first. His smile was tight with anticipation. "You ready?" "For what?" I asked. He laughed too quickly. "For the speech." Celeste stood just behind him in black silk, beautiful and bloodless. "You look strong, James," she said. I held her gaze. "I am." The room was full. Ruth near the front, Conrad at the side wall, department heads, route captains, finishing supervisors, 2 bank representatives, 3 cousins who always appeared when inheritance might be in the air, and nearly 40 employees who had given their backs and mornings to my company for more years than Adrian had ever arrived before noon. Helena was there too. She had wanted not to come. I insisted. She wore a dark blue dress that made her look younger and more frightened than I had ever seen her. She sat beside Ruth with her hands folded too tightly in her lap. Anyone looking at her would have thought she was an assistant dragged to the wrong event. Anyone looking carefully would have seen something else. When dessert plates were cleared, Adrian rose and tapped his glass. He thanked everyone for their loyalty during my father's recent health challenge. He spoke of continuity, future vision, operational modernization, new partnerships. He thanked Celeste for her support, which was understandable. Half his confidence had always come from hearing his own ambition repeated in a prettier voice. Then he turned toward me with the smile of a man already wearing another man's ring. "And now," he said, "the founder of Bernett Linen, my father, James Bernett, who has something important to share with all of us." There was applause. I stood slowly, not theatrically, just old enough that people leaned in. At the lectern, I looked out over the room and had the strange sensation that my life was dividing itself into before and after in plain sight. I do have something to share, I said. The room quieted. Most of you know I spent several weeks in recovery this winter. I was tired, overworked, less careful with my body than I had been with my invoices. That part is mine. A small ripple of knowing laughter. Good. Let them relax. What happened after that, I continued, showed me something I had delayed seeing for too long. Not about age, about character. Adrian's smile changed by a degree. Celeste's did not move at all. When a man is weak, people reveal themselves efficiently. Some sit by the bed and ask what he needs. Others arrive with tabs marking where he should sign. Silence. Real silence now. I did not look at my son yet. I looked instead at my employees. I built this business believing that if I worked hard enough, loyalty would pass naturally from father to son. As though blood were a management philosophy. That was my mistake. A company is not inherited like bone structure. It is held in trust by the people willing to protect what makes it worth owning. Ruth lowered her eyes then. Elena sat frozen. In the hospital, I said. I had a great deal of time to think. Also, thanks to a few honest people, I had access to information. Information about proposed sales, quiet reassurances to vendors, premature succession language, and efforts to describe me as less capable than I was. Now I looked at Adrian. His face had drained itself. Celeste still had control of hers, but only just. There was a thinness around her mouth I had not seen before. Fear, when it reaches elegant people, reveals how much of elegance is merely insulation. I will not drag this room through family ugliness, I said. There has already been enough of that. But I will say this clearly. No one who tried to reduce me in order to control this company will ever control it. The sound in the room was not a gasp. Gasping is too dramatic. It was something smaller and more intimate. The sound of many people revising their understanding at once. I took a folder from the lectern shelf and opened it. As of 3 weeks ago, Bernetta Linen and Supply was placed into a stewardship structure designed to protect employees, operations, and long-term service contracts from opportunism, vanity, and forced liquidation. Adrian stood halfway from his chair. What? I ignored him. Ruth Salazar has been appointed president, effective immediately. That earned a different sound. Relief, surprise. One person near the back actually exhaled loud enough to be heard. And controlling beneficiary of the company, I said, each word laid down carefully, is Elena Maris. It is difficult to describe what silence feels like when it lands on a room full of adults who understand the social order has just been set on fire without a single raised voice. It is not noise's absence. It is pressure. Elena looked as if she might faint. Adrian did not sit back down. You can't be serious. I turned then, finally, and met his eyes. I have never been more serious in your life. This is insane. No, I said. It is disciplined. Celeste rose with him. James, perhaps this isn't the place. It is exactly the place, I said. You preferred important things handled in rooms where people could witness them. I learned from observation. Her face changed then. For the first time since I had known her, she lost control completely. Not in volume, in complexion. The polished certainty left her. What remained was hunger in good tailoring. Adrian laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. You're giving my company to some nurse? No, I said. I'm refusing to give my company to a son who thought a rehabilitation wing was a boardroom. He took a step toward me. 2 department heads shifted in their seats. Ruth had already stood. Conrad remained seated, which is how I knew everything was legally sealed beyond interruption. "This is because you're angry," Adrian said, "because you hate that I was trying to move the company forward. No, it is because while I was in a hospital bed, you were discussing liquidity events. You were sick. I was tired. You were confused. I became confused only when listening to you." A few people looked down, not from embarrassment, to hide the fact that they agreed. Celeste tried a different route. She always did. "James," she said softly, "whatever misunderstanding happened, this is rash. That girl was in a position of influence over you." Elena flinched. I saw it. Then I saw something else. She straightened. Before I could speak, Ruth did. "The only influence Ms. Maris appears to have had," Ruth said into the stillness, "was reminding Mr. Bernetta he was not dead yet. There are sentences a room remembers for years. That was one of them." Adrian stared at Ruth as if he had forgotten other people existed. "This is absurd," he said. "You're all going along with this?" "No," I said quietly. "They are witnessing it." He turned back to me, and for one brief second I saw the child he had once been, standing in our yard after breaking a window with a baseball and trying to decide whether tears would save him. It almost unmade me. Almost. "You're choosing her over me," he said. The room disappeared for a moment. There was only that sentence and the wreckage inside it. "No," I answered. "You made your choice before I made mine." His eyes changed then. Whatever plea he had been trying to form hardened into contempt. It was cleaner for him that way. It let him keep his pride. Celeste touched his arm. "Adrian." He shook her off. "You'll regret this." There it was. Not sorrow, not shame. Threat. He had learned nothing. "Possibly," I said, "but not in the way you hope." He left first. Celeste followed half a breath later, but not before turning once toward Elena with a look so cold it might have cut glass. Elena did not look away. That was when I knew she would survive what I had placed in her hands. The doors closed behind them. No one moved. Then I folded the papers, stepped away from the lectern, and said the only thing left worth saying. Dessert was expensive. It would be a shame to waste it. The room laughed then, unevenly at first, then with the grateful violence of people released from holding their breath. Afterward, there were handshakes, questions, tears from two women who had worked in finishing since the 90s. One of the drivers kissed my cheek. Ruth stood beside Elena like a sentry while board members, bank officers, and staff approached one by one. Not to flatter her, to assess her, to decide whether they could stand with what had just happened. She answered simply. She did not perform gratitude. She did not pretend expertise she did not yet possess. She said she would listen, learn, and protect what should not be sold cheaply. That was enough. Outside in the parking lot, after most people had gone, I found her standing near the seawall with both arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "I didn't want him to look at me that way," she said. "I know." "Are you certain?" "No," I said. "Certainty is for younger people. I am convinced. That is different." She let out a breath that trembled on the way out. "What if I fail you?" I looked at the water, black, controlled, carrying its own depth without display. "You won't fail me by being afraid," I said, "only by becoming like them." She nodded once. I handed her a small brass key then. Not symbolic, real. The old office on the second floor of the plant. My office. She stared at it in her palm. "I should probably have this later." You should probably have it before someone tells you not to open the door." For the first time that night, she smiled. The months after were ugly in the practical ways revenge always is. Adrian contested nothing substantial because Conrad had anticipated every angle. But he sent letters. So did Celeste's attorney. There were accusations of undue influence, emotional instability, elder manipulation. Each one failed under scrutiny. The psychiatric report, the timing of filings, the witness patterns, the memos Ruth preserved, and Adrian's own eager paper trail all formed a shape even his lawyers disliked touching for long. He stopped calling me father after the second legal exchange. Then he stopped calling at all. People ask, when they hear stories like this, whether that silence was a relief. It was not. Relief is too clean a word. It was an amputation that happened to remove a source of pain and leave one behind. I still think of him. Of course I do. Blood does not evaporate because character disappoints it. Some evenings I sit in Teresa's chair by the window and remember Adrian at 11, red-cheeked and indignant, insisting he could fold fitted sheets if someone would only show him the trick. He never learned naturally. No one ever really does. But he tried for almost 10 minutes, and Teresa laughed until she had to lean against the counter. That boy is gone. Or perhaps he was only ever briefly visible. As for the company, it did not collapse under the weight of my spite, which is what Celeste predicted to a mutual acquaintance who reported back with great satisfaction. In fact, it steadied. Ruth ran operations with the authority she should have had years earlier. Helena moved slowly, asked hard questions, and refused every consultant who used the words pivot or disruption before understanding linen loss percentages. She spent 3 weeks in finishing, 2 in dispatch. She rode the New Haven hospital route at 4 in the morning and came back smelling faintly of steam and detergent, which I considered an excellent sign. The employees did not love her immediately, nor should they have. People who survive businesses like mine learn caution before loyalty. But they watched. They saw that she arrived early, stayed late, and never spoke to supervisors differently than she spoke to porters. They saw that she reopened retention reviews Adrian had frozen. They saw that she restored a widow's medical continuation after HR had quietly prepared to cut it. They saw that she asked the boiler crew what they needed before she asked the architects about redoing the lobby. That is how trust enters a place. Not by announcement, by accumulation. One evening, 6 months later, after most of the staff had gone, I found her in my old office standing at the window with the lights off. "I thought this room would make me feel powerful," she said. "And it mostly makes me feel responsible." I stood beside her. "Good," I said. "Power without responsibility is what put me in a hospital." She was quiet for a while. "Do you ever miss him?" The question did not offend me. That is another reason she was right for the role. She was not afraid of human contradictions. "Yes," I said. "Every version of him except the last one." She nodded as though that made perfect sense. Below us, in the yard, a late truck backed toward the loading dock. White bundles moved under warehouse lights. Men called to one another. Somewhere, a press released a tired metallic sigh. The company was alive in the only way that has ever mattered to me. Not as an idea, not as a legacy slogan, but as labor continuing past sunset because people trusted other people to keep their promises. I placed my hand on the window latch. Teresa used to say a family is the place where you learn whether love can survive truth. Elena glanced at me. Did it? I thought of my wife, of my son, of the long white corridors where my name had almost been taken from me, of the young woman beside me who had no claim to my blood, and yet had guarded my dignity more faithfully than my own heir. Sometimes, I said, truth is the only thing love leaves behind. She said nothing after that. Neither did I. We stood there in the darkened office while the plant kept breathing below us. And for the first time in a very long while, the business felt like it belonged to the right hands.